at Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's in Canada. His areas of specialization include phenomenology, German philosophy, and the philosophy of religion. He has an earlier, of course, we have here a more recent book. It's called The Dark Ground of Spirit, Schelling and the Unconscious, published by Routledge. And the earlier book is The Early Heidegger and Medieval Philosophy, Phenomenology for the God-Forsaken, if you would like us. It was published in 2006 by Catholic University of America. And there's also another work called Heidegger, A Very Critical Introduction. He holds currently the Canadian chair of the North American Schelling Society. Now, I think we begin straight away.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Department of English and the Center for Languages and the philosophers that seem to be scattered all over the campus for hosting me. I'd particularly like to thank Saitya for facilitating my visit. And I suppose I should thank the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute for funding it. I'm very happy to be here. This is the first time I've spoken in any Asian city. And of all the things that I'm going to speak on in my first Asian appearance, it will be Christianity. The following paper is based on a series of identifications, which I must at this stage leave largely undefended. I can only gesture to a line of thinking, a critique of modernity, that precedes me, and in which I hope to participate in my own way. The line begins with the German thinkers of disenchantment, particularly Carl Schmitt, Max Weber, passes then through the work of Karl Löwit, and in France, Marcel Gauchet, with a largely unknown Canadian contribution, the work of the political philosopher George Grant, an inspiration to be quite unknown internationally. The series of identifications in question are historical, not metaphysical identifications. Over them hovers Heidegger's neo-Schellingian saying, identity is not sameness. Every act of identification is also a disidentification, for only that which is already historically true can be identified. To state the identifications baldly and in their most vulnerable form, liberalism, the political ideology of modernity, the doctrine of negative freedom and atomistic individualism, for which every association with the other is always accidental, never a natural necessity. Liberalism, I say, is consumer capitalism. The belief in the perfectibility of society through competitive exchange and the maximization of happiness through an endless, fantasy-driven material upgrading of personal identity. But Christianity is liberalism, for it is Christianity that invents the individual, that abstract bearer of rights. And moreover, it is Christianity that institutes messianic time, which immanentized becomes a progress of humanity from darkness into light, a time that moves ineluctably from better to worse. I'm sorry, from worse to better. Perhaps both. And without these two, the free individual who transcends the natural circumstances of his or her coming into being, and the time that progresses, without these two, there is no capitalism and no consumerism, from which we get the strange conjunction, which I intend to pursue with a clue from Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling: Christianity is consumer capitalism. It is the basic gesture of modern Christianity to kill nature, the cosmic order that norms human living and dying in every ancient religion, and to reduce all natural values to exchange value on the one hand, and to immanentize transcendence, to incarnate God on the other hand. As Gauchet has argued, It is the transcendence of the Father which first renders nature an autonomous object, a free-floating thing that can be broken down and rebuilt in various ways. The doctrine of a creator God divests nature of numinous and divine power and sets it free. Disenchantment, however, did not begin in the 17th century. It began in the 12th century before Christ, when Moses codified the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, which Constantinian Christianity legislated as the basic metaphysical principle of the West. But it was not enough for God to go beyond nature. He needed also to become incarnate in nature in order for Western materialism to take shape. Today, we mistakenly think that Christianity has been discarded to the dustbin of history. In fact, Christian thought has become so internalized in the modern, has sunk so deep into our collective habits of living, as to become an autonomous, unconscious ideology. Christianity is the unconscious of the West, and increasingly, through the domination of other cultures by Western values, the unconscious of the world. The incarnation of the transcendent God occurs not only once in the flesh and blood of Jesus, but is perpetually renewed in plastic, steel, and silicone, in objects of use and pleasure, and in images of such things, which mediate for us possible lives. Matter in consumer capitalism becomes, like Mother Mary, capax Dei, spirit-bearing, but not divine. Note the crucial difference from the pantheistic impulse, which is almost universal outside the orbit of biblical religion, where the pantheist worships nature because of a lack of difference between matter and God. The consumer capitalist fetishizes a material order which has been set free from the creator God. Only when God becomes absolute transcendence, only when God disappears from the horizon of human possibilities, does matter become bearer of spirit. In the case of each of the above identifications, the is should be understood transitively. It has a direct object that can best be manifest by dropping the copula. So, liberalism consumes. Christianity liberates. Christianity consumes. Does that mean that all consumers are Christian? On a superficial level, this is obviously untrue. But on a deeper, ontological level, the matter is not so clear. According to the logic of antecedent and consequent, first articulated by Schelling in his celebrated freedom essay of 1809, the three identifications mean Christianity grounds liberalism, which in turn grounds consumer capitalism. Christianity makes liberal consumer capitalism possible. The latter is in every way the product of Christianity, which is not to say that it is reducible to it. No doubt, dogma developed, particularly in the decisive period between late medieval scholasticism through the Reformation to early modernity. But what developed was Christian ideology, nothing else. The West has no other proximate root. The forgetting of Christianity, which has reached epidemic proportions in the West, is a forgetting of the origins and destiny of liberal consumer capitalism, a forgetting of the current and predominant form of modernity itself. If there is to be a thinking of our era, it will only occur as a remembrance of Christianity, where Christianity is not pushed on the world as the triumph of Christ over all other gods, quite the contrary. Rather, where Christianity will be recognized as the past of the global consumer capitalist system, as that which grounds the increasingly homogeneous present of humanity, and which therefore hides itself in the present, even as it feeds and informs our thoughts and actions in the most surprising ways. I wish to follow this line of thinking, this theological theory of secularization, by distinction from the far more common secular theories of the theological, which begins with Schmitt and ends with Gauchet. back to an older origin in German idealism. We could talk of Kant and Hegel in this regard, and I hope to in a subsequent lecture, especially Hegel's understanding of Christianity as the vanishing mediator of modernity. But I wish rather to give the stage over to Schelling, because in a certain way, he, of all German idealists, is the only one deserving the title Christian philosopher. The only one who saw that to call Christianity the past of the modern is not to cancel or to preserve it, but rather to posit it as the ground which remains always active, capable of eruption into a new form at any moment. I stood on the steps of the Ambience Mall the other day, notified by various websites and tour guides that this is something I really had to see. This gargantuan symbol of the new India. I watched the girls and boys bustle up the stairs into the air-conditioned multinational space of shimmering surfaces, utopian promises, and transcendental desire, where I had just bought a coffee that costs more than the average slum dweller of Delhi lives on in a day. I tested my thesis on what I saw before me. An upper middle class Delhi couple in their early 20s, impeccably outfitted in the latest designer jeans, t-shirts, and leather shoes, are doing that amazing feat of multitasking that makes the heads of the older generation spin. They're climbing the stairs, they're having a lover's squabble, and they're texting their friends on their iPhones all at once. I asked myself, what is Christian about these two? And the answer came to me. 3 ontological structures, modes of being in the world, which are more essential to their identity than their own ethnic or religious heritages. 3 existentials, as Heidegger calls them, which makes them more like young people in Russia, China, Europe, or the US than, for example, the country people of traditional India. The first structure, their freedom from the past, their non-determination by the ways their parents lived and dressed and what they believed about life and death. Second, their hope in the future, which they anticipate as bringing greater and greater enjoyment, satisfaction, and personal development. And third, their proactive engagement with the present, which they do not accept as necessity, as karma, but as matter to be transformed into themselves, worked on by their irrepressibly free wills, something to be broken, changed, and consumed like food by a stomach. This is immanentized Christianity. Christianity in the formal sense. All that is left of it once it has been eviscerated of its dogmatic content, free from the law, anticipatory of the future, and actively engaged in transforming the present. And there was something disturbingly Schellingian about the scene, like a vision of Schelling's philosophy of revelation gone horribly wrong, where Christianity gives way to a final achievement of human unity in a post-national, post-ecclesial utopia. Only the utopia is a lie, in fact, a veil, hiding a restoration of the oldest system of human economy, slavery, but in a far more heinous form than that defended by the Greeks and the Romans. The ancients called a slave a slave. We call them citizens and insult them with the pretense of equality, even as we make it impossible for them to participate in power, aside from casting their ballot every few years. Let me explain. In the Ecclesiology of the late Schelling, the world, rather than the church, becomes the proper receptacle of the biblical revelation. Schelling envisions this happening in a way that avoids, on the one hand, accommodating revelation to an a priori criterion of rationality. This is the common mistake of Kant, Schleiermacher, and Hegel. And on the other hand, the fideism espoused by Jacobi, or later Kierkegaard. Schelling's post-ecclesial Christianity is not correlated with modernity, as though it were something other than it. Under the sign of the fourth evangelist, the mystical St. John, Schelling's Christianity is one that fully owns the modern as its own child. In the third age of revelation, neither external authorities nor private feelings will dominate consciousness. Rather, here, the outer and the inner side of Christianity become finally appropriate to each other. Such an age does not need a church in any conventional sense. Such an age is one in which society itself becomes church. The late Schelling's eschatological ecclesiology, rather than the far-flung speculation of a philosopher past his prime, is disturbingly prescient, provided we recognize with Weber, Loveth, Gaucher, the theological essence of consumer capitalism. It seems that Christianity has indeed conquered the world through the seemingly invincible fusion of two signature Christian notions, that of the dignity of the individual and the notion of historical progress, into the master signifier of the consumer. For what else is a consumer but an individual who dedicates his or her entire energy to constant material upgrades, fueled by fantasies of self-improvement on the assumption, however absurd, but plain to read in the symbolism of advertising, that he or she is thereby making himself, herself, a better person. The consumer dedicates his or her wealth to a private future that is always still to come, when he or she will finally achieve full and total recognition from the others. And yet, how could Schelling not disown this godless fulfillment of his dream as an inversion of what ought to be? For missing entirely from the picture is the heart of Schellingian Christianity, the unification of the human race under a common experience of the genuinely divine. Schelling's ecclesiology is predicated on a dialectic of Christianity and world, but when we hear dialectic, hold off on the Hegelian gloss. Schelling's dialectic is significantly different from Hegel's in ways which I hope to describe in a moment. The dialectic is something like this. The world is a first and fallen incarnation of the Father, or what Schelling calls the first potency. The Christ is the incarnate second potency, whose mission is to reunite the Father with the world. That is, to reunite the world and the absolute, which means, of course, the absolutization of the world, or the complete enworlding of the absolute. That is, the overcoming of the distinction between sacred and secular, transcendence and immanence. The reunification is achieved through the work of the Spirit in the final form of religion, the successor of historical Christianity, which Schelling calls philosophical religion. Schellingian Christianity is thus intrinsically secularizing. Now, I've given a puzzling little handout to you, to which I'd like to turn. This is by way of a kind of crash course in late Schellingian ontology. This is going to perhaps be puzzling, but it should help with the understanding of the other things I'm going to say. Now, there are three potencies which are essentially the structures of all that is and can be in Schelling. Three moments, if you like, if Hegel is your point of reference. Three structures to all that is. And these three potencies can be understood on various levels. I've parsed out three here: the logical level, the ontological level, and the ecclesiological level. Wolfgang Hochgräber at Frankfurt has famously proven that this whole doctrine of the potencies in Schelling is in fact a doctrine of predication. And on this level, we are talking about logic. But of course, what Hochgräber tends to undercut somewhat is the deeper point that the logic is an ontology. It's a theory of being, three modes of being, if you like. And in terms of the philosophy of history, which concerns us here, it is also a doctrine of the three ages of the church / the world. So how does this work? Let's look at this thing for a moment. So I've got it parsed out there in these three different columns, and there are three different what do you call it? Column and rows. Thank you. Rows and columns. 3 rows. So the 3 rows represent the 3 potencies. So the first row is potency 1, the second row is potency 2, the third row is potency 3. 1, 2, 3. And then the logic, ontology, ecclesiology is just going to articulate what these potencies are doing on each of these levels. So we'll just follow the logic formula on the left side there. The potencies as a logic, as a theory of predication. So this is quite simple logic, really. So simple, actually, that it can be explained to a child, which means it's probably true. It's basically this. In any predication, in any act of predication, we must distinguish the subject of predication, that of which something is predicated, from the predicate. So we say A is B. And we have an A, which is a subject, and we have the B, which is the predicate, which is said of the subject, and we have the two conjoined by this copula, is. Now, Schelling believes that these two, this subject of predication and the predicate itself, are actually 2 modes of being. The first is the logical subject, the A, which is presupposed, which is, if you like, the ground of the predicate. And the second, the predicate, is the second potency, that which is predicated of the first. You can see immediately that this second, the predicate, in a certain way needs this subject, else it floats free. Right? So a predicate without a subject is just an abstraction. It's just a verbal gerund. It's a nothing. But when attached to a subject, it becomes the attribute of a subject. But the subject, in a curious way, is a kind of nothingness for Schelling. It has on its own nothing really to be said of it, other than that it is that of which some things are to be said. A is B. Subject, first potency, predicate, second potency, and the full act of predication, the third potency. The third potency is the whole. So immediately, whatever else you just got from that peculiar little lesson in Schillingian logic, you will see that these 3 potencies can never be separated from each other. In fact, it is a distinction of what Duns Scotus calls a formal distinction. You really just have the 3 in one, which you then can distinguish in terms of these 3 different moments. You'll also notice something curious about the idea that the subject is nothing, but transitively exteriorizes itself in the predicate. And this is the idea that that subjects really are, there is really nothing behind them. They are nothing other than the predicates we attach to them. Even though we might be inclined to hypothesize or posit a kind of thing in itself, or a pure substance, which doesn't need predicates to be, logically speaking, there is no substance in itself. There is only the substance which is its predicates. It exteriorizes itself in its predicates. And similarly, the same can be said with the predicates. Of course, the predicates don't freely float around without a subject. So let's go and look at the ontology here, because this might make it clearer, or then again, maybe it won't. So we have then the 3 potencies articulated in terms of 3 modes of being. The first potency, das Sein Könnende, the being that can be. The second potency, das Sein Müssende, the being that must be. And the third potency, das Sein Sollende, the being that should be. What does this mean? And think always then in terms of the logic, and it might come a little clearer. Das Sein Könnende, the first potency, is, in other words, das An sich Seiende, that which is in itself. Schelling also aligns it with Aristotle's material cause, and in this regard he calls it substance, and speaks of it as limitless. It is limitless precisely because it lacks all delimitation. It is prior to any delimitation. It has not been determined. It is the determinable, not the determination. It is that which can be determined, and therefore it is free of determinations. It is absolute possibility. It is the doctrine of non-being, which is not nothing in Schelling. The second potency occupies the space of actuality. It is the being that must be what it is because it is what it is. In other words, it doesn't have possibilities. It is if you like, fastened to its being. Blue is blue. Blue is not a possibility as a predicate. It's simply blues. It's the bluing of anything. In this sense, it is determinable. It is a determination and a limiting principle in anything. It limits something to this predicate. Schelling aligns it with the formal cause in Aristotle, thus with actuality, that which actualizes the subject. But even more interestingly, he describes it as das außer sich Seiende, the being which is outside of itself. It has this ecstatic quality. Why would he say the being which is outside of itself? The first potency, the subject, is substance, it's in itself, sort of has something of its own, but it really has nothing of its own. But it acts as though it does. The second, the predicate, is ecstatic because it has no center. It just gives itself to the first. It is what the first says of itself. It is nothing, it exists only for the first. The third, a full active predication, A is B taken as a complex structure. Schelling most curiously describes as das Sein sollende, that being which should be, that ought to be, and he gets moral here. He says, this is the moral being, final cause, free, insofar as freedom is not the absence of determination, but self-determination. On a purely logical level, I think this means simply, this is the being which was being aimed at in the first two moments, right? The first two moments were for the sake of this. That for the sake of which you have a subject and a predicate is so that there could be this being that is predicated thus. The moral language is interesting, and that's because there should be a whole other level here where we speak about moral concepts and the structure of the personality. But for the sake of this talk, we will just say that in the third, we have not limitless freedom or freedom as negative, as absence of determination, nor do we have actuality without possibility. We have a possibility that actualizes itself, a possibility that, let's say, negates itself and makes itself into an actuality. A determination by itself. So this is why it is freedom. As Schelling says, freedom is not the absence of determination, it is self-determination. Right. Ecclesiology. Let's get more concrete now. The first potency is the first person of the Trinity, the Father. The second potency is the second person of the Trinity, the Son. The third potency is the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Immediately you can see how the Father, the invisible Father, nothing to be said of him until he exteriorizes himself into the Son. You can see how he occupies this logical space of subject and predication. And you can see how the Son, who can do nothing save what the Father shows him, who knows nothing other than what the Father says to him, who is nothing other than the word of the Father, the ecstatic, self-canonic one, is in this second position of logical predicate. And the Spirit, of course, is the relationship between the two. Schelling is a great reader of the patristics. Schelling then goes into a history of Christianity in which he aligns these three moments with various apostles. The first being Peter, the apostle who likes law, who's rigid and legalistic and a bit of a hard case. The second is Paul, who's a bit ecstatic and visionary and interiorizing, you know, with his private, his extra, let's say, his extra apostolic experience of the Christ. And the third is John, the one that Jesus loved, the one who was closest to Jesus' heart. And then further, Schelling will align these with three eras of the church. The first era of the church is the Roman Catholic Church, under the Father, under Peter. The second era of the church is Protestantism, the ecstatic church, the church which just negates and interiorizes without ever really pulling off a substantial core for itself. And the third age of the church, which he anticipates, is the philosophical religion in which world becomes church. Now let's see, we'll keep that in mind as we go through the next little bit, and then we'll come back to some more contemporary remarks. The church, for Schelling, is the form of the historical presence of Christ after the resurrection. Christianity inexorably aims at the unity of the fallen and redeemed world and the church, or the historical incarnations of the first and the second potency. It's as though God, the Father, first incarnates himself in this flock, which is creation. And the moment he utters it, it screws it up. And it becomes something spinning in, not something that doesn't image him at all, but rather spins in some kind of antagonistic, sinful denial of him. So the first incarnation is a flop. So he has to send the second one, which is the Christ, in order to redeem the first one. He's lost himself in the first. He incarnates himself in the second, recovers himself when the second brings the first and the second together in itself in the crucifixion. The end of the Christian revelation, then, will be the self-cancellation of the church as an institution, existing either on the margin of the human community, as in the first century, or in confrontation with the world, as in radical Protestantism. The church, Schelling says, must become identical with the human community. This means that nothing authentically human can remain outside the church. All cultural and scientific activity must find a place within the church. How does Schelling envision this happening? Of course, this is not original. This is, in some respects, a discourse that has been going on in German idealism for a better part of a half century. Schelling envisions this enworlding of the church as avoiding, on the one hand, a liberal accommodation of church to the world, in which Christianity becomes watered down until it is merely a general spiritual outlook without historical content. Eine allgemeine Lehre, eine alles geschichtlichen Inhalts ermangelten Religion. And how can we not hear Kant, Fichte, Schleiermacher in this, in their efforts to secularize Christianity and make it somehow palatable for the world. This is not the way to go. But on the other hand, no authoritarian imposition of religion upon culture, which will destroy the legitimate autonomy of the sciences. Schelling does not want this. Historically, it has been the task of the Roman Church, the Church of St. Peter, or the Petrine Church, to prevent the former, that is the liberal accommodation, by exercising political power for the sake of maintaining an external unity of belief in Christendom. And it has been the task of the Protestant Church, the Church of Paul, or the Pauline Church, to prevent authoritarianism through the progressive separation of church and state. You can see that the Pauline Church is the instigator of modernity here. And we could actually just say modernity for Pauline Church, early modernity. The Petrine Church, medieval church, unified the external Christian community through political control of culture. The Pauline Church emancipated culture from church control by interiorizing the revelation, privatizing the revelation. The Roman Church achieved unity at the cost of interiority, the merely external unity of medieval Christendom, which was, Schelling argues, at the cost of the neglected inner life of Christianity, in which a chaos of private Christianity was permitted to flourish. The Protestant Church achieved interiority at the cost of unity, demolishing the external authority of the church and empowering the individual's direct experience of God, but with mostly negative results. The endless fragmentation of the church into minor churches and the subjectivization of Christianity. But without the Reformation, Schelling argues, modernity would never have occurred. Paradoxically, the emancipation of philosophy and science from theology, i.e. modernity, was necessary if these sciences were to develop as authentically Christian discourses. For Schelling, an authentically Christian science is one that is autonomous and free. Free from Rome, the West gives birth to the Enlightenment, and the sciences flourish. But the self-understanding of the secular is that the world thrives outside of Christianity. Schelling's point appears to be that this is an illusion, the Enlightenment and Romanticism are through and through Christian, only they fail to recognize it. The third age of the church will occur when culture and science are at once autonomous and Christian. That is, when the Christian orientation of Western culture and science becomes spontaneous and imminent. Schelling thus envisions as the end, eschaton, of Christianity, indeed the end of history, the exhaustive assimilation of all human enterprise into the gospel, or alternatively, the exhaustive assimilation of the gospel into all human enterprise. There is no question that in such an immanentized Christendom, the sciences, above all philosophy, would remain free. Schelling is not speaking of a neo-orthodox vision of the arts and sciences subordinate to theology. In a certain way, the Schellingian future of Christianity is a Christianity without theology, insofar as every science now becomes the content of theology. Or a religion without religion, insofar as everything becomes religious. Or a world without a church, insofar as world becomes church. Only in this way will the special knowledge of revelation become the general knowledge of all people. The method of Schelling's positive philosophy has already prepared the way for this transmutation of revelation into science. What was perceived as alien and other than reason now becomes reason's very own. Here I'd like to make a little digression on a figure from the late Schelling. The whole of the late Schelling's thought stands under a figure, an image that comes out of Paul's letter to the Philippians, Paul's Christological hymn in the Philippians. In that hymn, Paul says that Christ did not deem equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and took the form of a slave, using the word kenosis, self-emptying, the self-emptying of Christ into the non-divine. This figure becomes for Schelling a logical, ontological figure for the proper attitude of reason to reality. That is, reason empties itself before reality. It can only empty itself because it possesses something. What it possesses is that rich world of concepts which have been developed in the history of idealism. The great a priori systems of German thought are the inalienable content of reason. And Schelling says, reason, when it is most rational, empties itself of this content before the real. Takes on the form of a slave, becomes a receiver of the truth. And he calls this the ecstasy der Vernunft, the ecstasy of reason. And it stands in the, and you see ecstasy now, ecstasy as standing outside yourself. Yeah? The ecstasy of reason, the kenosis of reason, the self-emptying humiliation, ablassum of reason, which now repeats this theological gesture of emptying, laying down, self-direction. The image stands in the sharpest contrast to the earlier image that Schelling used to describe reason, which is intellektuelle Anschauung, intellectual intuition. And in a sense, it's precisely the opposite thing. In the intellectual intuition, which the young Schelling, along with Fichte and others, developed, reason discovers that it needs nothing, that it is its own object, that there is nothing outside of itself, that it is entirely self-contained and immanent and possesses all that it needs. There is no real outside of it before which it would bow down. So something big happens in Schelling's thought, and it stands under this image, der Ekstase der Vernunft. So what you see then in the history in history itself, the history of the West, is this ecstasy of science and philosophy before revelation. Science, philosophy, the autonomous enterprise of culture, of secular culture, initiated in the Enlightenment, directs itself in the philosophical religion, in the final ecstasy of reason, when reason takes over as its own ground a truth which did not originate it, a truth which is initially foreign to it, but which becomes so intimate to it as to function as a virtual a priori. Christianity is not reason's product. Here the difference with Hegel is acute. Nevertheless, reason so assimilates revelation as to become spontaneously Christian in all that it does. The history of Christianity, the history of the revelation of the truth of being, begins at the opposite end, with Christ preaching to a world a word that is alien to it, a world that follows its own atheistic law. The word takes root in this foreign soil and develops naturally out of it until it has colonized it entirely. The first age of the church, which Schelling describes as the prehistoric church, is a church in opposition to the world. The pre-Nicene patristic church, which demonized philosophy, and in turn was demonized by it. This is the church that says no to the world and whatever wisdom the world offers. A church which is the custodian of a revelation that must appear as folly to the world. The dogmas and the cult of the church first develop as a means to protect the revelation from the unchristian environment in which it first appears. But the world-church contradiction can only be temporary. For as we have said, the telos of Christianity is towards an assimilation of all that is human. This assimilation can only be successive, that is, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, or a past, a present, and a future. The historic church begins in the moment when the church becomes a world religion. The three ages of the church that follow correspond to the three principal apostles, Peter, Paul, and John, who embody in a finite sense the qualities of the three potencies, respectively substance, subjectivity, and the unity of the two. And the progressive enworlding of the church, which is also the erasure of the church as an historical entity. With the Reformation, the hitherto neglected life of Christendom rebels against the merely external uniformity of the Roman Catholic Church. And under the inspiration of Paul, the first Protestant, the apostle who denies any dependency on the authority of others, but claims for himself a direct access to the revelation, the spirit, the ideal, the eccentric principle of freedom and knowledge come to dominate Christendom. Paul corresponds to Elias, the fiery Old Testament prophet, and in general to the spirit of prophetism, which is a mobile and dialectical spirit, by distinction from the spirit of the law, which fixes and defines. Paul can do nothing without Peter. The Pauline church is grounded in its historical presupposition, the Petrine church, but without being restrained by it. The Pauline church is the church of negative freedom, of inner authority, which refuses to concede to anything external. It negates the blind external uniformity of the Petrine church in order to give birth to, quote, a free ideal unity, end quote. Another quote from Schelling, quote, Paul provided a principle by which the church could again be free, not from unity, but from a blind unity, end quote. The whole purpose of Protestantism is to make possible the transition from political uniformity to, quote, a unity which is comprehended and understood and therefore free, end quote. The weakness of the Pauline church is its primarily negative and destructive orientation. The whole essence of Protestantism, Schelling argues, consists in destruction. The patron of the third age of the church is the apostle whom we are told in the New Testament Jesus loved, which Schelling interprets to mean the apostle in whom Jesus alone saw himself. John possesses simultaneously transparent clarity and unfathomable mystical depths, the simplicity of Peter and the dialectical subtlety and interiority of Paul. The Johannine church will fulfill the mission of Christ to bring about the kingdom of God, where God is all in all, but not in an abstract Hegelian sense, rather in a theism that includes the whole divine economy, that is, the whole history of mythology and revelation within it. Cult will then become perfect expression of knowledge. The inner experience of each will become identical with the common experience of all. In this way, the sundering of peoples into nations, which in the philosophy of mythology Schelling attributes to the devolution of spirit, to the loss of God consciousness at the very beginning. This devolution, which resulted in the fragmentation of divinity and the emergence of polytheism simultaneous with the emergence of nations. This is redressed. the world becomes one under God once again. The question, is this the end? In the early 90s, Francis Fukuyama resurrected Kogel's neo-Hegelian theory of the end of history. Liberal capitalism is the final form of human culture, Fukuyama argued, for the struggle for recognition, which is the motor of history, is now appeased by economics. In the face of resurgent nationalism in Europe, Russia, and Asia, we are told that the thesis was hopelessly naive. However, Fukuyama's argument was not that capitalism conquers xenophobia or ends war, but rather that it leaves no other political economic system standing. Fascism, Marxism, communitarianism, none can survive the invincible combination of technology and commerce which capitalism alone effectively produces. While Hegel thought history had already ended with the Prussian state, Schelling makes it plain that the future church, which will end history, is not yet. We might ask, must the third age not always be deferred? Is it not the eschaton which ends time by resolving the worldly struggle between law and freedom? On this side of the end of time, are we not destined to experience a partially revealed truth, the revelation as we have received it in our historical and cultural contexts, and which always stands to be corrected, supplemented, or even wholly negated by the advent of the new? As my colleague Saitya has argued, an eternally deferred eschaton desubstantializes both state and church, renders every form of political or ecclesiastical organization contingent and fallible. The difficulty with this messianic reading of Schelling's Ecclesiology is that Schelling insists on speaking of the third age as something to be realized in history. Not only something to come, but something which we ought to be working towards actively realizing here and now. Indeed, his philosophy of mythology and revelation intends nothing less than to facilitate the transition from the contradiction between the Petrine and the Pauline churches to a post-national, post-ecclesiastical, wholly immanent Christianity. World become church. Thus, I would include Schelling in the lineage of Kant and Hegel as a thinker of secularization, albeit in a different sense, certainly than Hegel envisioned. What would Schelling think of our present moment? Would the decline of Christianity into at best a bland, contempt-free public ethic, at worst a historical anachronism, cause him to lose his faith? Would he give up his traditional Christian beliefs in creation, Trinity, incarnation, and so on? Perhaps become a Zen Buddhist? Or alternatively, a cynical culture critic? Since we cannot say what Schelling would say, we must answer the question for ourselves, but in a Schellingian way. That is, we must venture a Schellingian answer to a question Schelling never asked and could not have asked. In a certain way, the privatization of Christianity, the domination of the ecstatic Pauline church of interior revelation over the Petrine church of substantial law, reached its zenith in European societies in the 70s, when most Christians in the developed world became indistinguishable from other spiritual consumers. If they still go to church at all, Christians go for reasons very different from their forefathers, not out of allegiance to tradition, but because they, quote, get something out of it, end quote. The same private search for self-fulfillment that fuels the exploding yoga industry keeps a modicum of church Christianity alive in the West. Aside from a margin of ghettoized, ultra-conservative Catholics, there is little nostalgia for the lost uniformity of the Petrine church among those of the educated classes who still call themselves Christian, but rather a widespread indifference, bordering on hostility to public religion. The modern separation of church and state, private and public ethics, is generally agreed to be essential to safeguarding rational people from the mania of fundamentalism. On the other hand, an exterior unity of belief has been achieved in the developed world today, against which the uniformity of medieval Christendom pales in comparison. I mean the unanimous faith in capital, commerce, and consumption. At least, among the privileged minority, the post-Christian world has produced something which Schelling never anticipated. Have we not achieved what Schelling dreamed of? The exteriorization of interior unity, the abolition of nations as distinct societies with competing and incompatible claims to totality, under the pressure of the homogeneity of desire, the homogeneity of consumer desire, which makes us one in the world in a way in which we have never before been one. Putin and Modi might call themselves nationalists, but the nations they insist on defining and defending against the requisite unseen enemy, these so-called nations are increasingly indistinguishable from one another. The consumer capitalist juggernaut traverses all borders, paving over cultural and ethnic differences, and bringing with it the monoculture of liberal consumerism, necessary if capital is to flow freely. This late capitalism, which has as its end what Kojève called the universal and homogeneous state, and what Fukuyama described as the elimination of ethnic and religious strife in the one interconnected shopping mall of the world, is this not the culmination of Schellingian Christianity? That is, the restoration of the external unity of the whole human race through the unification of inner life. There is a pragmatic argument to be made against this claim. Ultimately, we're going to have to go with a more metaphysical argument, but let's look at this for a moment. Schellingian philosophical religion is universal. It leaves no one out. Consumer capitalism subsists on a pretense of universalizability. It is not, in fact, universal. It presumes a slave labor force, hidden away somewhere, an obscene supplement, an underculture which must subsist outside the system as an indivisible remainder to the formula. From a basic materialist perspective, it is simply not possible for all of us to enjoy the standard of living of the middle-class consumer. It would be interesting to explore from a Schellingian perspective how the poor must always be excluded from consumer capitalism, must always be outside the system, as ground, as excluded other, which makes the system itself possible. But even if we bought into the liberal dream of the universalizability of consumerism through technology, or the colonization of Mars, or whatever, even if we believe that lovely fairy tale, we have strong Schellingian reasons to reject the current state of the world as the end of history. The capitalist achievement of an ostensibly egalitarian society at the price of human diversity, the fetishizing of progress, and the elevation of a depoliticized science above all philosophy of religion is the reverse of the Johannine unity of law and freedom envisioned by Schelling. Recall that in the Neoplatonic ontology that remains the backdrop of all Schelling's work, unity has two different senses. There is the unity of the one, the good beyond being, or in Schelling's language, the absolutely indifferent, which is reached through a transcendence of interior and exterior diversity. One learns to see the one in the many, and so become disidentified with the particular ego and its finite desires. But the many do not for that reason cease to exist. The diversity of beings remains as the condition of the possibility of the experience of the unity which binds them. This unity in diversity is the pinnacle of revelation for the late Schelling. This is the Christ consciousness, which Schelling foresees as becoming the common spiritual inheritance of mankind. And at the opposite spectrum, there is the homogeneously one, the unity of the indifferently multiple, the mere numerical plurality, which is the common denominator of all that exists. On this level, everything is one because aside from its numerical countability, everything is indistinguishable from everything else. Things have no real qualities and no value aside from their marketability or exchange value. The homogeneity of consumer desire, I submit, is the interior unity of the merely quantifiable. One thrill after another, one fulfilled appetite succeeding another, one new car in the driveway, one new figure in the salary, one more communication gadget. This cannot be what Schelling had in mind when he envisioned each of us finding in the one revelation the supreme knowledge that fulfills the spiritual longing. Late modern consumerism is not the successor of Christianity, but devolved Christianity. Or better, Christianity in disavowal of itself. As in a classic case of hysteria, where physical symptoms both reveal and conceal repressed traumata, the empty forms of the basic Christian dogmas persist, bereft of their historical content, which are inadmissible to contemporary secular liberals. Thus do Christian dogmas become transformed into a number of absurd ideologies. The incarnation, repressed as a thought, returns as a fetish for products, the finite spirit impossible effort to fully inhabit things by totally identifying itself with them. The call to convert becomes the consumer's endless effort to continually improve himself by endlessly varying the externals, body sculpting, facelifts, fashion, multiple partnering, and the tourist's increasingly impossible search for the exotic. The hope for the kingdom of God becomes the addiction to the immediate future, as though anything really depends on the release of the next generation of iPad. But most perversely Schellingian of all, these ideologies are no longer forced upon others with political might. They come from the disenfranchised peoples themselves, who want the same bourgeois life most of us in developed economies enjoy as a birthright, and which they know primarily through mass media. China no longer needs to clamp down on student dissent, as they did in 1989, nor do they need to censor the surreal, horrific news footage of tanks driving over unarmed students in Tiananmen Square. They simply allow the students to shop, for pacified consumers no longer care about 1989. Consumerism is the empire that conquers, not by external authority, but by internal drive. Take away the transcendent term of revelation, and what Schelling says of the Johannine Church applies exactly to the conquest of liberal capitalism over every other system. And I quote, "Everyone will come to it by his own volition and belong to it through his own conviction, for in it each spirit will have found a home." End quote.
Sean, we'll stop at 5:15 now.
Okay, just 2 sentences. But Schellingian revelation always has a transcendent term, even in its final immanentized form. It is essentially theological. Surely our age is the lowest point in the history of revelation, a point lower than which Schelling ever anticipated, in which Christianity, evacuated of all content, does not so much become world as having lost all means of distinguishing itself from it, that is, having lost a living sense of the transcendent, collapses upon itself. But this nadir of philosophical development, precisely because it is the lowest point in a world historical process that Schelling characterizes as the self-manifestation of God, this can neither be the end of Christianity nor the end of history. Thank you for your attention.
Well, that's very exciting and engaging. Of course, the whole the distant version of the romantic absolute comes up in one part of the talk, and then the connection with human capitalism and its relationship with Christianity, whether Christianity acts as its conscious, and the tension that arises, and the need and the possibility of overcoming that. That's the kind of concern that we're expressing. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion on diverse issues that you've raised here. Thank you very much. This is very exhilarating, very passionately involved with your purpose. And now we have our own Chilling here. So I request Saitya to respond to the topic.
In fact, so many things are going around in my head, and I got the paper just 15 minutes back before. So I'm too close to what you're saying. So I'm not having enough time to make clear what I'm thinking, clear to myself what I'm thinking. I come back later when, as the discussion will proceed, my thinking will also become more clear to myself. interests me is the strange paradoxical position that Schelling makes for himself. On one hand, he's neither following the theological, the secularizing of the theological project of modernity, the line that from Kant through Fichte to Hegel and so on and so forth, that line was taken. And on the other hand, he was also avoiding certain thinking of the theological, which, as you said, Kierkegaard, etc. So it's a kind of double construction going on in both sides. On the one hand, he's refusing to call himself the secular secular in the sense that the world, the religion is to be assimilated to the world. This is the, if you think that this is the idea of secularism, that the religion is to be assimilated to what exists in the world as worldly. And on the other hand, he's also separating himself from the world to be theologized in a certain sense. In the sense that it is not church insofar as the church itself needs to be cancelled out. The self-cancellation of the church, or the world itself needs to be cancelled out in both senses. So it's a kind of thinking in erasure in that sense, that how the world and church in a very coming together simultaneously cancels themselves out. And it's a kind of it's a fascinating and very interesting interesting position that Schelling has, which is difficult for us to think of, and that makes Schelling, as you said, so untimely and so different difficult kind of thinker. And then we now can appreciate in a sense when we pause the closure of the end of history in a different sense than that was possible in Schelling's own time. So many different things, so many different threads need to be weaved together here. Schelling's distinction of religion from mythology, from myth, insofar as religion itself a step which is beyond myth. And then Schelling's distinguishing of religion from the church, from the institutional form of religion in as early as 1804 in Philosophy and Religion. Schelling gives at least two or three senses of religion. Religion as exoteric, religion as esoteric, and so on and so forth. So in that sense that religion itself is not exhausted. The sense of religion itself, its multiplicity, cannot be exhausted in the institutionalized determination of it as such. Not alone, not to talk about in the ethical determination of what is religion. So in that sense that religion, the notion of the future or eschaton that we talked about is itself, in a very profound sense, is religious. Because religion itself is eschatology in its very essence. Essence not, I don't mean to say the essence that we generally mean to be, but in its innermost sense, that religion is eschatological. And this eschatological sense of religion is never exhausted in any secularizing project of theological. And that's, I think, the task of thinking for us today, is to release that eschatological potentiality of religion, which is eschatology not necessarily in particular Christendom sense, but it is, one can take out that eschatological sense as a philosophical opening of any and every system of thought. You see, the eschatology in that sense would be that philosophical opening of every discourse that institutes itself. So double eschatology will have that paradoxical double sense. On the one hand, it will destitute or de-institutes any given institutions of the world in terms of given religion. And at the same time, it is also opening up of any institution to something which is just a reminder of the world, the remainder of all thought, the irreducible remainder of all thought. The paradoxical strategy of Schellingian thinking is what interests me a lot. On the one hand, it deinstitutionalizes of all closure of institutions in terms of a destitution which is opening up of futurity. And at the same time, it also doesn't make his own thinking merely negative gesture. Also, it is an affirmation of what is always to be realized, as you say, here and now, which is universal, but a universal that is not realized, as you beautifully pointed out, in today's neoliberal, consumer-based secular society. This is a false religion, a false universal. It's a kind of abuse of religion in the name of religion. It's an abuse of religion which paradoxically also wants to think without religion. In the sense that Jacob Tobé's phrase, which Carl Smith liked very much, is that in today's world, everything is theology apart from theology itself. So it is against this theologization you should be able to think of religion outside theology. In a sense, it is a theological theology. Or it is a theological, also not a theological, in the sense that it is not even secular. So outside this binary opposition of a theology of secularism and theology of consumer-basis society, we should be able to think of a theological theology as a schedule. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. The notion of eschatology as applying to all discourses, I find quite interesting. Is it on? Yeah. So the notion of eschatology as something that is imminent to every discourse, that strikes me as a deeply Schellingian thought. And I'm thinking here of of how Heidegger speaks of how the sciences really only gets going when it comes to its point of crisis, where it can no longer maintain the conditions that made it possible, but stands towards in waiting for something new to happen. And I also recognize, of course, in your own line of thinking, which I'm just newly acquainted with, but I'm looking forward to learn more about it, the tendency for a much more formal reading of eschatology than perhaps I am offering here, and perhaps by way of apologia in the old-fashioned sense of explanation of what I'm doing. I've always been very hesitant of this ontological distinction of Heidegger's, whereby we render a discourse somehow more universal or philosophical or ontological or metaphysical by ridding it of its concrete reference points. And so I understand myself somehow to be a thinker of the ontic in this sense, because without denying, of course, ontology, but I feel that Heidegger himself gets into deep trouble by working on this formal level and believing that on the ontic level, let's say political, religious questions belong, others can talk about them, but I'm going to clean up the ontology, work with formal concepts. And that seems to be not a very Schellingian kind of way of proceeding. So Schelling is very concrete in the end of the Philosophie der Aufklärung, where he begins to speak of history. And he's speaking of real events, he's speaking of real history, not an idealized history. And it was this that motivated me to be equally concrete in my Schellingian analysis of the present, to actually really talk about now in Schellingian terms. And that's where I find myself wondering, could we, if your eschatology, if your formal eschatology is self-consciously, endlessly deferred, does it lose all power of critique? That is, does it become a kind of playful nihilism without thanks? And has Schelling not himself avoided this by being embarrassingly concrete about what he really thought this was going to happen? He really anticipated this happening, and only thus, by speaking of the history of the real, does his philosophy become really political. So this is one question I have, because the religion after religion talk, we've had a fair bit of it, and one wonders at a certain point it just starts to sound like gas, or something, just air And we need to be much more concrete. So this is why I was interested in going into this history of the critique of the secular and raising this kind of embarrassing question of how deeply theological the reigning ideologies in the world today are. Right? So then we can talk about concrete entities. So I like very much your idea of a critique of the theological now from a completely new perspective, which is not a secularist, nor is it dogmatically Christian, but it's absolutely recognizing the theological content of modernity, but it's not recognizing it from either of those places. And I think that's the place, that's the spot I'm trying to occupy as well.
I guess the question